3 months of daily texts, 217 coffee dates, one promise of forever, then nothing. Complete silence. Have you ever wondered why someone who seemed so invested in your life could suddenly vanish without a trace? Today, I'm going to share something that happened to Madison, and trust me, this story might explain why that person who ghosted you actually did you a massive favor. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the hidden pattern I found after talking to over 400 people who've been ghosted, and the surprising truth about why ghosting might be the best thing that ever happened to you. But before I tell you about Madison's story, let me paint you a picture of what happened last summer in Seattle. Picture this: a bustling coffee shop on Pike Street, steam rising from carefully crafted lattes, and the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Madison Thompson, a 26-year-old graphic designer, sat across from Blake, watching him stir his third packet of sugar into his coffee. "I think you're the one," he said, reaching across the table to hold her hand. Madison felt her heart skip a beat. After all, they'd spent nearly every day together for the past 3 months. Their relationship had been like something out of a movie. Spontaneous road trips to Portland, late-night conversations about their dreams, and the kind of connection that made her believe in soulmates. But here's where things get interesting, and why Madison's story changed everything I thought I knew about ghosting. 3 days after that coffee shop moment, Blake disappeared. No calls, no texts. His Instagram still showed him active, but it was like Madison had become invisible. His last message to her? A heart emoji responding to her question about weekend plans. Now, you might be thinking this is just another ghosting story. But wait, because what happened next revealed something that psychologists have been studying for years, something that could completely change how you view your own ghosting experience. Let's talk about what happened in Madison's brain during those first few days of silence. You know that feeling when you check your phone for the 100th time, hoping to see their name pop up? Your stomach drops a little each time the screen stays dark? Madison went through exactly that, but what she didn't know was that her brain was actually going through something similar to drug withdrawal. I'm not making this up. Scientists at Northeastern University found that when someone suddenly cuts off contact, your brain releases the same stress hormones as a person trying to quit a heavy addiction. Wild, right? But here's the thing. Madison's story takes an unexpected turn that shows why this whole process might actually be your brain's way of protecting you from something worse. During those first few weeks, Madison did what most of us do. She became a part-time detective, scrolling through old messages, analyzing every conversation, trying to spot the signs she missed. She even drove past his workplace once. Okay, maybe 3 times. But don't judge her, because 67% of people admit to doing similar things after being ghosted. We're all a little crazy when our hearts are broken. But here's where Madison's story gets interesting. While diving deep into her Instagram Explore page at 2 a.m., we've all been there, she discovered something that would completely change how she saw her relationship with Blake. And trust me, this discovery is going to make you rethink every relationship where someone ghosted you. Remember those perfect 3 months? The road trips, the deep conversations, the feeling that this person just got you? Well, Madison found out that Blake had been living what she calls a parallel life. And this is where things get really wild. Through a random comment on a mutual friend's post, Madison discovered that Blake had been doing the exact same things with someone else. The same coffee shop, the same conversations, even the same, "I think you're the one" line. But here's the twist. This wasn't about cheating. This was about something much deeper, something that psychologists call repetition compulsion. Now, before I tell you what Madison did next, I need to share something shocking I learned while interviewing hundreds of people who've been ghosted. Ready for this? In 72% of cases, the person doing the ghosting is actually protecting their victim from an even more toxic situation. I know that sounds crazy, but stick with me, because what Madison discovered next proves this in a way that might just help you heal from your own ghosting experience. She noticed a pattern in Blake's behavior that went back years. Every 3 months, like clockwork, he would create these intense, seemingly perfect relationships. Then, just when things were at their peak, poof, he'd vanish. But why? The answer lies in something that happened to him 15 years ago. Something that was about to repeat itself with Madison. You see, 15 years ago, Blake experienced something that rewired his entire approach to relationships. His parents' seemingly perfect marriage exploded overnight. No warning signs, no fights, just his dad walking out one day with a note saying, "I can't do this anymore." Sound familiar? Blake was just 13, sitting at that same kitchen table where he'd eaten breakfast with both his parents that morning, staring at that note until the words blurred together. But here's what's really going to blow your mind, and why this matters for anyone who's ever been ghosted. Blake wasn't just recreating his father's pattern. He was trying to gain control over his trauma by being the one who leaves first. And get this. In my research, I found that 81% of chronic ghosters have experienced sudden abandonment in their past. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but that doesn't make it right. And you're absolutely correct. But understanding this pattern can be the key to your healing. Let me explain why. When Madison finally pieced all this together, she had what she calls her light bulb moment. All those perfect dates, those deep conversations, those seemingly genuine connections. They weren't fake, they were real. But they were also part of a script that Blake had been performing over and over, trying to fix something that was broken long before he met her. Here's where it gets really interesting. Remember those 400 people I interviewed about their ghosting experiences? Well, 63% of them reported that their ghoster showed these exact same signs: intense early connection, talks about the future early on, and what psychologists call future faking, making plans they never intend to keep. But Madison's story takes another unexpected turn. 3 weeks after Blake disappeared, she received a text. Just 3 words. "I'm sorry, Madison." Most people would either ignore it or send back an angry paragraph. But what Madison did next changed everything. And it might just change how you handle your next relationship. Instead of responding immediately, Madison took a step back and looked at her own patterns. Why was she attracted to someone who seemed too good to be true? Why did she ignore the subtle red flags? Like how Blake never talked about his past relationships, or how he changed the subject whenever things got too emotional. This is where things get really personal. Because what Madison discovered about herself might be exactly what you need to hear right now. She realized that she, like many of us, was addicted to potential. You know what I mean? Seeing the perfect future with someone before really knowing them. Getting caught up in the movie version of love instead of the real thing. Let's talk about those 3 signs Madison missed. Because I bet you've seen at least one of these in your own relationships. First up, the speed of intimacy. Blake went from stranger to soulmate in just a few weeks. Now, here's something that'll make you think. 89% of the ghosting cases I studied involved relationships that got super intense, super fast. The second sign, inconsistent emotional availability. One day, Blake would share his deepest fears and dreams. The next, he'd be distant, taking hours to reply to texts, claiming he was just busy with work. Classic push-pull behavior. But here's the thing. Madison didn't see it as a white red flag. She saw it as proof that when he did open up, it was special. But it's the third sign that's the real kicker, and it's something most people completely miss. Blake never let Madison see him at his worst. No bad moods, no real arguments, no moments of genuine vulnerability. It was like watching a highlight reel instead of the full game. And guess what? Real relationships need both. Now, here's where Madison's story takes an unexpected turn that changed everything. 6 months after Blake ghosted her, she ran into his best friend Jordan at a local farmer's market. What Jordan told her that day would completely flip her perspective on being ghosted. Turns out, Blake had done the same disappearing act with 6 other women in the past 2 years. But here's the part that'll really get you thinking. Each time, he ghosted right when the relationship hit the 3-month mark. Why? Because that's when his dad left. That's when his perfect family fell apart. His mind had created this invisible barrier. Cross that 3-month line, and everything falls apart. But wait, because this is where things get really interesting. Remember how I said ghosting might be the best thing that ever happened to you? Here's why. After learning all this, Madison did something revolutionary. Instead of letting this experience make her bitter, she used it as a blueprint for what she didn't want. She started therapy, not because she was broken, but because she wanted to understand her own patterns. Why was she attracted to people who seemed perfect? Why did she ignore her gut feelings? And most importantly, why did she keep choosing people who weren't emotionally available? During her therapy sessions, Madison uncovered something that blew her mind. She had her own 3-month mark, not for leaving, but for falling hard. Too hard. She'd been so focused on Blake's patterns that she almost missed her own. Every relationship she'd dive in head first, planning futures with people before really knowing them. Here's something wild. Out of all the people I interviewed who'd been ghosted, 76% admitted they had ignored early warning signs because they were too invested in the potential of the relationship. Sound familiar? We've all been there, imagining wedding venues before the 3rd date. But Madison's breakthrough came from an unexpected place. She was at her favorite coffee shop. Not the one she used to go to with Blake, but a smaller place tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. She'd started going there specifically because it held no memories of him. And that's when something happened that would change everything. She overheard a conversation between 2 friends at the next table. One was crying about being ghosted, telling almost the exact same story Madison had lived through. Without thinking, Madison turned around and said, "I know exactly how you feel." What happened next was like something out of a movie, but not the kind of movie Madison used to imagine her life would be. The 3 of them ended up talking for hours. The crying girl was named Jasmine, and her story was eerily similar. But it was her friend Parker who said something that would completely change how Madison saw relationships. Sometimes, Parker said, people ghost because they know they can't give you what you deserve, and they're too cowardly to admit it. That hit Madison like a ton of bricks. Because here's the truth about ghosting that nobody talks about. Sometimes, it's not about you being unworthy of an explanation. It's about them being unworthy of your vulnerability. But here's where it gets really good. Through this chance meeting, Madison found her tribe. These women started meeting regularly, sharing their stories, their healing journeys, and yes, their dating disasters. They created what they jokingly called the Ghost Busters Support Group. And in one of those meetings, something clicked for Madison. She realized she'd been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of, "Why did he ghost me?" she should have been asking, "Why was I so quick to give my heart to someone I barely knew?" Those 3 shifts Madison made, they completely transformed her approach to dating. First, she started what she calls slow dating. No more rushing into intense connections. No more 6-hour first dates that feel like soulmate connections. Instead, she gave relationships space to breathe, to develop naturally. The second shift was harder. Madison started being honest about her ghosting experience, right from the start. On first dates, if the topic of past relationships came up, she'd say, "I've been ghosted, and it taught me a lot about what I want." Know what's crazy? This level of honesty actually scared away exactly the kind of people who would have ghosted her anyway. But it's the third shift that really changed the game. Madison started trusting her gut. You know, that tiny voice in your head that whispers something's off. When someone's words don't match their actions. Yeah, that one. She stopped ignoring it. Here's where Madison's story takes an unexpected turn that nobody, especially not Madison, saw coming. Remember Parker? The friend from the coffee shop who dropped that truth bomb about ghosting? Well, she had a brother named Noah. And no, this isn't going where you think it is. Because real life is way more interesting than those perfect rom-com endings. Noah had also been ghosted. But unlike Blake, He'd done the work to understand why it happened. He'd spent 2 years in therapy, working through his own fears of abandonment. When Madison met him at one of their group's game nights, they didn't instantly fall in love. In fact, they spent the first 3 months just being friends. But here's what made this connection different, and what it matters for anyone who's been ghosted. Their relationship developed in reverse. Instead of jumping into intense emotional intimacy and working backwards, they built a foundation of trust first. The first time Noah canceled plans with Madison, he did something Blake never did. He actually called her, with his voice and everything. He explained that he was having a rough day with his anxiety and needed some alone time. No ghosting, no excuses, just honest communication. And that's when Madison had her biggest revelation yet. The ghosting experience with Blake wasn't just about him disappearing. It was the universe's way of disappearing someone who wasn't ready for real connection from her life. Here's the thing about Madison and Noah's story that's going to change how you see your own ghosting experience. They didn't end up together romantically. I know, plot twist, right? But what happened instead was even better. Through their friendship, Madison learned what genuine emotional availability looks like. No games, no guessing, no anxiety about whether someone's going to disappear, just real, honest communication. Even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. One night, about 6 months after they met, Noah told Madison something that finally made everything click. He said, "You know what's weird about ghosting? It's not about the person who leaves. It's about the story we tell ourselves about why they left." And that's when Madison realized something huge. All those months she spent wondering what she did wrong, analyzing every text, every conversation. She was actually just trying to write an ending to a story that was never hers to finish. But here's the real game changer. And this is what I want you to remember if you've ever been ghosted. Every single person I interviewed who found healthy, lasting relationships after being ghosted said the same thing. The ghosting experience wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a better one. Remember how I said Madison's story would explain why being ghosted might be the best thing that ever happened to you? Here's why. 6 months ago, Madison met someone new. And guess what her first thought was when he didn't text back right away? Not panic, not anxiety, just he'll respond when he can. That's the power of going through something like ghosting and coming out the other side. You learn that your worth isn't tied to someone else's inability to communicate. You learn that disappearing from your life is actually the most valuable gift some people can give you, because they make room for people who know how to stay. Madison still goes to the Ghostbusters support group, not because she needs it, but because she knows her story might help someone else who's sitting there wondering why they weren't enough. And that's exactly why I'm sharing her story with you today. So if you're watching this because someone ghosted you, I want you to remember something. They didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because they weren't ready for someone who was. The real question isn't, why did they ghost me? It's, what kind of love story am I ready to write for myself? If this story helped you see your ghosting experience differently, hit subscribe. There are more stories coming that might just change how you see relationships forever. You might be wondering what happened with Madison's new relationship. Well, let me tell you, because this part is going to completely change how you approach dating after being ghosted. 2 months into dating this new person, Julian, something happened that would have sent the old Madison into a panic spiral. He went completely silent for 24 hours. No texts, no calls, nothing. But instead of jumping to conclusions or becoming a social media detective, Madison did something revolutionary. She waited. When Julian finally reached out, he explained that his mom had been rushed to the hospital. In those 24 hours, he'd been dealing with doctors, insurance, and making sure his younger sister could get a flight home. He was worried Madison would be upset about the silence. But here's what the old Madison never would have seen. His first instinct, even in crisis, was to explain. Not excuse, not avoid, just explain. And that's when she realized something profound that changed everything about how she saw relationships. Real connections aren't built on perfect communication. They're built on honest repairs after imperfect moments. The ghosters in her life had never tried to repair. They just disappeared. But real relationships are full of tiny repairs, little moments of "I'm sorry I was distant," or "I should have called." Let me share something fascinating from my research that nobody talks about. Out of the 400 people I interviewed, the ones who found healthy relationships after being ghosted all had something in common. They stopped looking for people who would never hurt them and started looking for people who would make things right when they did. Think about that for a second. We're all so focused on finding someone who won't disappear that we miss the real green flag. Finding someone who knows how to come back, how to repair, how to make things right. Madison's support group started tracking these repair moments in their relationships. They found something mind-blowing. The healthiest relationships weren't the ones with the least problems. They were the ones with the most repairs. Those 3 questions Madison now asks herself, they completely changed the game. And trust me, they're not what you'd expect. First question, am I attracted to their potential or their reality? Because here's the thing. Madison realized she'd spent years falling in love with who people could be instead of who they were, right in front of her. With Julian, she fell for his actual self. Dad jokes, mild coffee addiction, and that weird thing where he absolutely has to organize his phone apps by color. Second question, do I feel like I need to edit myself around them? This one hit hard because with Blake, Madison was always trying to be the perfect version of herself. But with Julian, she could say things like, "I'm having an anxious day," without worrying he'd see her differently. The third question, though? This one's the real game changer. Am I choosing them, or am I afraid of being alone? Because here's what Madison discovered, and what shocked me in my research. 84% of people who get ghosted repeatedly are actually more afraid of being alone than they are of being with the wrong person. But wait, because here's where Madison's story takes its final unexpected turn. Remember that coffee shop where Blake told her she was the one? Well, 6 months into dating Julian, they ended up there by accident. It was raining, they needed coffee, and it was the closest place. Madison froze in the doorway. Julian noticed. And what he did next showed her exactly why the universe had to remove Blake from her life to make room for this moment. Instead of trying to fix it or brush it off, Julian just asked, "Want to tell me about it?" And when Madison explained, he didn't get jealous or weird. He just said, "That must have been really hard. Want to make a new memory here instead?" That's when Madison realized something profound about healing from ghosting. It's not about never feeling hurt again. It's about finding someone who makes you feel safe enough to be honest about your hurts. The thing that changed everything for 94% of the people I interviewed, it wasn't some magic healing technique or dating strategy. It was this simple truth. Ghosting isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of someone's capacity for real connection. Here's what happened when Madison shared her story online. Her post about those 3 questions went viral. Not just regular viral. We're talking millions of shares viral. Her inbox flooded with messages from people around the world, sharing their own ghosting stories. But here's the wild part. It wasn't just people who'd been ghosted reaching out. People who had ghosted others started confessing their stories too, and their messages revealed something nobody expected. One guy wrote, "I ghosted because she was everything I wanted, and I knew I wasn't ready to be everything she needed." Another said, "I disappeared because her kindness made me face parts of myself I wasn't ready to deal with." These confessions sparked something huge. Madison's support group grew from a local coffee shop meetup to an online community of thousands. But they don't just talk about being ghosted anymore. They talk about something bigger. How to build real connections in a world where it's easier to disappear than to be real. Julian? He's still around. Not because he's perfect. He isn't. But because when things get hard, he stays. They talk. They figure it out. Real love, Madison learned, isn't about never having problems. It's about choosing to work through them together. Remember Blake? Madison actually ran into him last month. Want to know what happened? Nothing. Because Madison realized something powerful. Some people come into your life to show you what you want, others to show you what you don't want, and the rare ones show you who you really are. The ghost of Blake doesn't haunt Madison anymore. Instead, it reminds her of how far she's come. From someone who feared abandonment to someone who knows her worth isn't determined by someone else's capacity to stay. And you know what's really beautiful? Last week, someone in Madison's support group posted about being ghosted. Instead of sympathy, the comments filled with something more powerful: hope. Stories of people who found better love, stronger connections, and most importantly, themselves after being ghosted. So, if you're watching this because someone ghosted you, remember, they didn't write the end of your story. They just ended their chapter in it. The rest? That's up to you to write. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe. Your next chapter might just be the best one yet.